Hey guys, tonight we're taking a journey back in time, slipping into the cobblestone streets and hazy cafés of Paris in the 1920s. Imagine you're there. You can almost feel the damp chill of the Seine cutting through the evening air. See the flickering gas lamps casting long shadows down narrow alleys. And hear the distant, tinny clamor of a jazz band spilling from a cellar club. It's a city humming with the nervous energy of a new era. A city still a little stunned, a little breathless. After the Great War, you probably won't survive this deep dive into history without your eyelids getting heavy. But that's kind of the point, isn't it? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing on the Pont Neuf, the oldest bridge in Paris, the city of light stretching out before you. The war that ripped Europe apart is finally over. The air, once thick with the acrid smell of fear and gunpowder, is now scented with fresh bread and Gauloise cigarettes. Soldiers, back from the trenches, are trying to forget what they've seen. Artists and writers, a new wave of them, are flooding into the city, seeking inspiration and a place to belong. Everyone is looking for a way to cope, to escape, to feel something other than the lingering ache of a lost generation. It was into this fertile, emotionally exhausted soil that a new kind of relief was first sown. This is the moment, the historical fact that sets the stage. The post-war Paris of the early 1920s wasn't just a party town. It was a city grappling with widespread trauma, where shell-shocked veterans suffered from what we now understand as PTSD. And a pervasive sense of grief hung in the air. This emotional landscape was ripe for something that promised oblivion, a quick fix for profound pain. And that's exactly what the medical community, with the best of intentions, offered: the new miracle cure-all, a patented cough syrup, a painkiller, and a sedative all in one. It was called heroin, and it was considered an astonishing advancement. The quirky tidbit that might make your brain buzz for a moment is that the very word, heroin, came from the German word, heroisch, meaning heroic, a nod to its perceived power to combat pain and illness. It was a truly heroic claim, one that would turn out to be deeply ironic. You can imagine a young pharmacist, perhaps one who just returned from the front, carefully weighing out the white powder, humming a tune as he sealed it in a small glass vial. He wasn't a pusher, he was a healer, a trusted professional providing what the doctors prescribed. They didn't know the full story yet. They hadn't seen the future. It was just another tool in the medical bag, a better version of morphine, or so they thought. Historians still argue whether the medical community's initial embrace of heroin was a result of genuine naivety or simply a byproduct of the era's aggressive push for new pharmaceutical innovations at any cost. Whatever the reason, the seeds were planted. In the coming years, that simple vial of heroic medicine would take root and spread like a suffocating vine across the city of light, transforming it from a place of hopeful revival into something much darker. For now, though, you just feel the gentle Parisian rain beginning to fall, and you're wrapped in the quiet, expectant calm of a city on the cusp of a very sleepy, very dangerous new craze. The rain is a steady patter now, a gentle drumming on the zinc rooftops. You duck under the striped awning of a small, quiet pharmacy. Inside, the air smells of antiseptic and old paper. On the shelves, bottles of colored liquids sit like jewels, each promising a different kind of relief. This is where the story gets really bizarre, where the naivete of the era feels almost cinematic. Because in the years immediately following the war, this humble shop was your gateway to what would soon be known as the heroin craze. It wasn't a dark alley deal, it was a transaction with a respectable, white-coated man behind a counter. This is the mainstream historical fact that you absolutely have to understand. Heroin was, for a time, a completely legal and widely marketed pharmaceutical, invented in 1874 by an English chemist, but commercialized by Bayer in Germany in 1898. It was first sold as a non-addictive morphine substitute and a fantastic cough suppressant. Think about that for a second. The company that brought you aspirin, and later, plastic, was also enthusiastically hawking what we now know is one of the most addictive substances on the planet. Your doctor, without a second thought, would write you a prescription for a pesky cough or a headache. You could pick it up as easily as you could a loaf of bread. A quick, easy fix for a world still aching from its wounds. The quirky or fringe tidbit of the day is that in addition to its use in cough syrups, heroin was also sold in a variety of other, equally baffling forms. There were heroin-based elixirs marketed for a surprising range of ailments. From insomnia and anxiety to, and this is a real head-scratcher, tuberculosis. Imagine a doctor prescribing a potent opiate for a debilitating lung disease. It sounds like something out of a bad joke, right? The logic was that it would quell the painful cough, which it did, but at a catastrophic cost. The patients, already weakened, would often become addicted and then die not just from their illness but from complications related to their addiction. It was a vicious cycle of well-meaning but woefully misinformed medicine. It reminds me of those old advertisements for crocodile dung sunscreen we talked about last time. People believed what they were told, especially when the person telling them wore a lab coat. You watch as a well-dressed woman, her face pale with fatigue, approaches the counter. She's clutching a slip of paper, her gloved hands trembling slightly. You can't hear her words, but you know what she's there for. A tonic to help her sleep, or maybe a calmative for her nerves. The pharmacist nods sympathetically, retrieves a small bottle from a high shelf, and hands it over. It's so mundane, so routine, that it's terrifying. There's no suspicion, no judgment, only an exchange of francs for a dose of oblivion. Historians still argue whether the medical community, particularly those in France, genuinely believed in heroin's non-addictive properties or if they simply ignored the mounting evidence of its dangers in favor of profit and a fast solution for a demanding public. Either way, the slow, silent drip of the drug into Parisian society was well underway. The city's nervous energy, once a source of creativity, was about to be dulled, then hollowed out, by this seemingly benign white powder. As you leave the shop, the streets feel less lively, more muted, as if the whole city is on a powerful sedative. The patter of rain has subsided, leaving the streets slick and gleaming under the moon's light. As you turn a corner, the quiet of the pharmacy fades, replaced by a low thrum that grows louder with every step. You're being drawn towards the vibrant heart of the city's nightlife, a place where the old guard is being replaced by a new, more defiant rhythm. This is Montmartre, a labyrinth of narrow, winding streets and steep staircases leading to a world of bohemian abandon. It's here, in the smoky haze of jazz clubs and raucous cabarets, that the story of heroin shifts from a medical narrative to a social one. The historical fact that anchors this moment is the rise of jazz in Paris. American soldiers and musicians brought this new sound with them during and after the war. Jazz wasn't just music, it was a revolution in rhythm, a frantic, improvisational beat that felt like the antithesis of the stiff, formal waltzes of the past. It was music for a generation that had seen too much and wanted to live faster, brighter. Places like the Le Boeuf sur la Toit and the Bal Negre became legendary, packed with artists, writers, and socialites all dancing, drinking, and trying to forget. The energy was electric, a kind of manic happiness that promised to fill the void left by the war. Into this scene, the miracle medicine from the pharmacy found its new home. The quirky tidbit that connects these two worlds is the way heroin became inextricably linked to the jazz and cabaret scene. Performers, often exhausted from late-night gigs and constant travel, were initially drawn to it as a performance enhancer, a way to stay awake and to dull the relentless fatigue. For singers, it was thought to be a remarkable throat soother. For musicians, it supposedly sharpened their focus, letting them lose themselves in the complex improvisations of the music. And for the party-goers, it was a fashionable accessory, a clandestine indulgence that offered a deeper, more profound kind of escape than alcohol alone. You can almost see a sleek, sequined woman in a flapper dress excusing herself from a crowded dance floor to a quiet corner, pulling a small, corked vial from her purse. It wasn't about being sick anymore, it was about being in the know. You're standing at the entrance to a club. A bouncer, his face a grim mask, checks your wrist for the stamp. Inside, the air is thick with cigarette smoke and perfume. The saxophone wails, a lonely, mournful sound, while the piano answers with a playful staccato. A group of young men in tweed jackets and women with bobbed hair and bold lipstick are laughing a little too loudly. Their eyes, though, seem distant, a little too calm. The conversation is punctuated by whispered asides, furtive gestures. It's here that the drug stopped being a secret between a doctor and a patient and started becoming a secret shared between friends. It was the ultimate, edgy party favor. Historians still argue whether the allure of heroin in these circles was primarily a search for genuine artistic inspiration, a misguided attempt at self-medication for psychological pain, or simply a fashionable pursuit of a new, dangerous thrill. Whatever the motivation, the drug was no longer just a cure, it was a currency of cool. An initiation rite into the city's dark, dazzling underworld, and you're just getting pulled in. The music is a living thing, a pulsing beat that seems to find its way into your bones. You've moved from the entrance to a quiet table in the corner, nursing a drink you've long forgotten about. The air is thick with the sweet smell of cigarette smoke, and the conversations around you are hushed and conspiratorial. This is the inner circle, the bohemian elite of Paris, where the drug wasn't just a party favor, it was a tragic muse. The historical fact that defines this tragic chapter is the profound influence of heroin on the lives and work of many of the era's most celebrated artists. This wasn't a phenomenon limited to anonymous musicians. It was a deeply rooted and often romanticized part of the creative process for many luminaries. Think of artists like Jean Cocteau, a brilliant and multi-talented figure who became a vocal advocate for the drug. For him and others, heroin was seen as a way to unlock a deeper level of consciousness, to strip away the mundane and get to the raw, unfiltered truth of human experience. He famously wrote about his addiction, not with shame, but with a kind of poetic resignation, almost celebrating it as a necessary evil for a true artist. You can see it in his art, in the strange, dreamlike quality of his films and the frantic lines of his drawings. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this time is the ritualistic nature of the drug's use in these circles. It wasn't just a casual habit, it was a performance, a private ceremony. Artists and writers would gather in dimly lit apartments, a small silver spoon and a lit candle becoming their tools. The act of preparing the drug, the flash of the needle, was often as significant as the high itself. It was a shared experience of both communion and self-destruction. The quiet hiss of the drug being drawn into a syringe was the soundtrack to late-night conversations about art, philosophy, and the emptiness left by a war that seemed to haunt everyone, even those who hadn't fought. This was not a mindless escape. It was a deliberate plunge into an abyss they believed held creative secrets. You're watching a poet at a nearby table. His eyes are wide, and his pupils are just tiny pinpricks. He's scribbling furiously in a small leather notebook, his hand moving so fast it seems to blur. The words are flowing from him like a torrent, but his body is still and relaxed, almost slack. He looks at once intensely alive and deeply absent. His friend, an aspiring painter, is slumped in his chair, a placid smile on his face, a small glass vial half empty beside him. They aren't trying to forget the world, they're trying to see it in a new, distorted way. This is the fatal romance of the bohemian set. Historians still argue whether the creative output of these artists was genuinely enhanced by their addiction, or if the drug merely served as a crutch, a tragic symptom of a deeper malaise that ultimately destroyed their health and, in many cases, their lives. Regardless, the line between artistic expression and self-destruction became incredibly blurred in the cafés and apartments of 1920s Paris, a line that would soon be erased for good. The quiet hum of the jazz club feels less joyous now, more like the low, mournful drone of a warning. You step out of the jazz club and into the quiet of the pre-dawn streets. The air is cool and a little damp, and the glamorous, smoky world of Montmartre feels like a fragile dream you're waking up from. But the drug that was a tragic muse for the artists is not going to stay contained within their exclusive bohemian circles. It's a disease with no cure, and it's about to spread. The narrative of heroin in Paris is now about to move from a private, artistic romance to a public, city-wide catastrophe. This is the mainstream historical fact that marks this new phase. Heroin's use began to seep from the artistic and wealthy enclaves into the broader social fabric of Paris. It was no longer just a drug for poets and painters, but for a new and diverse range of people. You start to see it in the hands of working-class people, the shopgirls, the factory workers, the street sweepers. The price of heroin, in the early years, was surprisingly low, making it accessible to a wider demographic than more expensive illicit drugs. For a few francs, you could buy a brief escape from the grinding monotony of poverty and the soul-crushing reality of post-war life. It became a new way to cope with the hardships of a city that was still recovering. A quieter, more insidious kind of post-war exhaustion that didn't make headlines. The quirky or fringe tidbit of this particular spread is the subtle but significant role that social gatherings outside of the famous clubs played in its dissemination. Think of a quiet back room of a neighborhood bistro, not just the legendary cabarets, or a small, crowded apartment in the 13th arrondissement. This is where the drug was passed around like a secret recipe. A trusted friend whispering its supposed benefits to another. It was a more intimate, more human scale spread than the splashy public use in the clubs. Historians still argue whether this quiet spread was more of a symptom of the era's generalized malaise or if it was a deliberate, opportunistic expansion by new black market players who saw an untapped demographic in the working class. It was a slow, silent poison, dripping into the capillaries of the city. You're watching the city wake up now. A baker is kneading dough in a back alley, the scent of flour and yeast filling the air. A concierge is sweeping the front stoop of an apartment building, her face etched with a silent weariness. You notice a small boy running an errand, and he almost collides with a man who stumbles out of a doorway. His eyes bloodshot and unfocused. A small, paper-wrapped packet slipping from his pocket. It's not the dramatic, artistic figure from the last section, it's just a man. The drug has lost its glamour and become something much more banal and much more terrifying. The myth of the heroic drug is officially over. The reality of a widespread, destructive addiction is beginning to take hold, not as a whisper in a dark club, but as a dull, agonizing moan in the heart of the city itself. The gray morning light is filtering through the Parisian windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The city is in a state of quiet transition, and you can sense a shift in the collective consciousness. The glamour and mystique of the drug are beginning to fade, replaced by a growing, nagging sense of unease. The casual availability of heroin, once seen as a sign of modern progress, is now starting to look like a terrible mistake. Society's honeymoon with the heroic medicine is over, and the first signs of a hangover are setting in. The mainstream historical fact that encapsulates this turning point is the international and national pushback against the drug. The United States, after witnessing its own burgeoning addiction crisis, passed the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act in 1914. This was a significant move, effectively making it illegal to sell or possess opiates without a doctor's prescription and a tax stamp. For a time, France lagged behind, but mounting international pressure and a growing awareness of the domestic problem forced their hand. In 1916, France passed its own legislation, the Loi du 12 Juillet 1916, which began to regulate narcotics, and then a more robust law in 1920 to bring them in line with other nations. These were the first official declarations that the party was over, that this was not a harmless cough medicine but a dangerous societal ill. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this period is the sheer unpreparedness of the authorities for this new kind of problem. The laws were on the books, but no one really knew how to enforce them. The French police, the Sûreté, were used to dealing with traditional crimes, theft, murder, political dissent. They had no playbook for a black market in a white powder. Their initial attempts were often clumsy and comical. They might raid a quiet apartment and find a few grams of heroin, only to have the users claim it was for a medical condition, which was technically still a legal gray area. Historians still argue whether the initial regulatory push was more a moral panic driven by a few highly publicized cases or a genuine, albeit slow, response to a widespread and worsening public health crisis. The truth, as usual, is probably somewhere in the middle. You see a newspaper vendor on the corner, shouting the morning headlines. The front page features an artist's sketch of a shadowy figure. Not a jazz musician but a new archetype, the droger, or drug pusher. The image is lurid and sensationalized. The narrative is shifting from one of artistic rebellion to one of criminal degeneracy. You can feel the city's mood changing. The initial fascination with the drug is hardening into fear and moral condemnation. A once celebrated escape is now an object of public scorn. The door to the pharmacy is no longer open to just anyone. You watch as a woman, looking ill and desperate, tries the door, only to find it locked. A sign on the door says something about a prescription only. She looks defeated, and you know what's coming next. When a legal supply is cut off, an illegal one always fills the void. The locked pharmacy door feels like a sign, a symbolic end to an era of naive trust. But as you know, history abhors a vacuum. When a legitimate source of supply dries up, an illegitimate one rushes in to fill the space. You're now witnessing a more sinister, shadowy part of the Parisian landscape come to life. The city, which once sold heroin openly, now has to contend with a new breed of entrepreneur, the black market drug dealer. The mainstream historical fact that defines this shift is the opportunistic emergence of sophisticated smuggling networks. With the American and now French governments cracking down, the supply chains didn't vanish, they just went underground. Think of Prohibition-era America. The same forces were at play in Paris. Smugglers, often with connections to established criminal gangs, began to reroute their shipments. Heroin, once a product of legitimate German and Swiss pharmaceutical companies, was now being transported in clandestine shipments, often concealed in ordinary goods. A popular method was to smuggle it across borders in hollowed-out books, inside furniture, or even sewn into the linings of coats. It was a new, high-stakes game of cat and mouse, one the police were woefully unprepared to play. A quirky or fringe tidbit of this time is the surprising role of certain social figures in facilitating this illicit trade. It wasn't just hardened criminals, sometimes. It was a disgraced aristocrat or a charming, down-on-their-luck artist who saw an easy way to make a living. These people, with their social connections and ability to move in circles that the police would never suspect, became the linchpins of the new black market. You could be at a quiet, high-class dinner party, and a conversation about a new avant-garde play could seamlessly shift to the whispered details of where to acquire the good stuff. The drug's cachet shifted from artistic rebellion to forbidden exclusivity, available only to those with the right connections. You're standing near a bustling market street, and you notice a man leaning casually against a lamppost, his eyes scanning the crowd. He's not overtly suspicious, but he has an air of quiet menace about him. A young woman, nervously clutching her purse, approaches him, and a swift, almost invisible exchange takes place. The transaction is over in a second, and they both melt back into the crowd as if nothing happened. This is the new normal. The opiate-addicted poet from the last section now has a different kind of problem. Not just their addiction, but the danger of seeking out a new, unregulated supply. Historians still argue whether the black market's rapid rise was a direct and inevitable consequence of government regulation or if it was an independent criminal phenomenon that merely capitalized on the new legal landscape. Regardless, the City of Light was now casting a long shadow. A shadow filled with the whispered promises of a secret world. A world where the only rules were those of the street. The lamppost transaction is over, and the city's shadow world is now unknown. If in spoken reality, the glamorous, cinematic moments of the early craze are gone, replaced by the mundane, soul-crushing reality of addiction. This isn't a story of artists seeking inspiration anymore, it's a quiet, daily tragedy unfolding in countless small apartments and forgotten corners of Paris. You're no longer a spectator at a wild party, but an observer of the quiet moments of despair that follow. The mainstream historical fact that brings this reality into focus is the devastating toll that widespread addiction took on daily life. For many Parisians, the drug became the center of their existence, not a supplement to it. The routines of life, going to work, cooking dinner, taking care of family, all began to crumble under the weight of a constant need for the drug. A typical day for an addict was a frantic cycle of waking up sick, hustling to find a few francs, and then desperately seeking out a dealer to get their next fix. Jobs were lost, relationships were destroyed, and the simple pleasures of life faded away, replaced by a singular, all-consuming obsession. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this time is the strange, almost ritualistic behavior that developed among addicts to conceal their use. They became masters of deception, hiding their track marks with long sleeves and scarves. and developing elaborate codes and signals to communicate with dealers and other users. A simple, innocuous phrase like, "Do you have a match?" might be a signal to an unwitting bystander, but a secret question about the availability of the drug to the person in the know. They became chameleons, blending into the background of a cafe or a street market. Their addiction a carefully guarded secret from their family and friends. It reminds me of the lengths people went to during Prohibition to get a drink, the secret knock on a door, the hushed password. But this was so much more insidious. Historians still argue whether the widespread denial of addiction was a product of the era's social norms against discussing such a thing, or if it was a deep-seated psychological defense mechanism that allowed people to continue their self-destructive behavior. You're watching a woman, perhaps a seamstress, sitting alone in a small park. She's meticulously darning a sock, but her hands are trembling. Every few minutes, she glances nervously at the end of the street. Her eyes are hollow, her face gaunt. She's not looking for inspiration or a high, she's looking for relief. You can almost feel the physical ache of her withdrawal, the gnawing sickness in her stomach. The romance is gone. The bohemian dream has turned into a nightmare of quiet suffering, one that is playing out on every street corner, in every forgotten room, across the entire city. The music is gone, replaced by a silent, dreadful hum of need. The park bench is empty now, but the lingering feeling of quiet despair remains. As the story unfolds, it becomes clear that the impact of the craze wasn't evenly distributed. Certain groups were more vulnerable, and the heroin epidemic found a particularly tragic hold on them. This is the moment where we focus on a specific demographic, a group whose roles were already in flux, and whose pain was often hidden in plain sight: the women of 1920s Paris. The mainstream historical fact is that women, particularly those in the upper and middle classes, were disproportionately affected by the spread of heroin. This might seem counterintuitive, given the stereotype of the junkie as a disheveled man on the street. But in the early days, women were the primary consumers of over-the-counter and prescribed nerve tonics and patent medicines, many of which contained opiates. They were often struggling with a uniquely feminine set of anxieties: the pressure to maintain a perfect home, the silent grief of losing a loved one in the war, and the claustrophobia of societal expectations. Heroin, initially, was seen as a sanctioned, respectable way to cope with these silent stresses. It was their Valium of the day, a way to keep up appearances while falling apart on the inside. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this era is how the drug's use became tied to the changing social norms and the new, liberating fashions of the Roaring Twenties. Think of the flapper, her bobbed hair, short dress, and defiant attitude. She was a symbol of freedom and modernity. But for some, this freedom came with a new kind of pressure. Heroin could be a way to stay thin, to suppress appetite in a society obsessed with a new, slim ideal. Or it could be a way to dull the fear of a world that was moving too fast. It was an addiction hidden behind a fashionable facade. You can almost picture a young socialite at a glamorous party, her beaded dress sparkling under the lights, her smile a little too fixed, and in a hidden pocket, a small vial of oblivion. Historians still argue whether the vulnerability of women to heroin addiction was a result of their overprescription by male doctors, a symptom of their societal powerlessness and anxiety, or a perverse byproduct of the era's new, more liberated culture. The truth is likely a combination of all three. You imagine a society hostess, once the life of the party, now hosting increasingly quiet and sparse gatherings. Her guests wonder why she looks so tired, why her movements are so slow and deliberate. She's no longer the charming, quick-witted woman they knew. She's become a phantom in her own home, a ghost in her own life, consumed by a craving that no one talks about. The silent suffering of these women is a crucial, heartbreaking chapter in the history of the craze. The initial glamour of the drug has been completely stripped away, leaving behind a profound and agonizing emptiness. The silence of the hostess's home feels heavier than any noise. The personal tragedies we've witnessed so far are part of a larger tapestry, one woven with the threads of famous, and sometimes infamous, lives. The heroin craze wasn't just a quiet plague on the common man. It ensnared some of the most visible and celebrated figures of the day, turning their fame into a spotlight on their slow, public decay. This is the mainstream historical fact that gives a face to the tragedy, the numerous notable figures who fell prey to the drug's fatal allure. Jean Cocteau, a polymath we mentioned earlier, became the most public face of this struggle. He wrote about his addiction with a raw, unflinching honesty in his book Opium, Diary of a Cure. His life was a constant battle between his creative genius and the physical and emotional slavery of his addiction. He survived it, unlike many others, but the scars were visible in his later work and his perpetually frail appearance. Then there was the American poet Harry Crosby, a member of the Lost Generation. His life and tragic death by suicide in 1929 were deeply intertwined with his use of heroin, which he romanticized as a path to a higher consciousness. His story became a cautionary tale for those who believed the drug was a harmless muse. A quirky or fringe tidbit is the role of the infamous photographer and socialite Man Ray. While not a known user himself, he was part of the circle and documented the era's bohemian scene with his camera. His portraits of Cocteau and other figures often captured a certain hollow-eyed, ethereal quality that, in retrospect, seems to hint at the drug's presence in their lives. He captured the tragic glamour of the era, the way a person could appear so beautiful and so broken at the same time. It's a testament to the drug's insidious nature that even in the most artistic and self-aware circles, its destructive power was often mistaken for a kind of spiritual enlightenment. Historians still argue whether the romanticization of heroin by figures like Cocteau inadvertently glorified its use for a younger, impressionable generation, or if their public struggles ultimately served as a vital warning that helped bring an end to the craze. You're looking at an old photograph, a black and white image. A man with wild, dark hair and an intense gaze stares back at you. His name is Jean Cocteau. The image is striking, powerful, and yet you can't help but notice the dark circles under his eyes, the thinness of his face. He looks like a man haunted, a man who has seen too much and felt too little. This image, and countless others like it, tells a story not of a heroic drug, but of a quiet, agonizing surrender. The heroes of the past have become the casualties of the present. The black and white photograph of Cocteau fades from your mind's eye, leaving you with a sense of profound sadness. But even as the realities of addiction were becoming undeniable, another, more disturbing phenomenon was taking hold. The oral and visual media of the time were still casting the drug in a cloak of mystique. The drogue du jour, mystique became a self-perpetuating cycle, turning a public health crisis into a morbidly fascinating cultural trend. This is the mainstream historical fact that highlights this odd dichotomy: the French press and popular culture, particularly in the mid to late 1920s, began to romanticize the drug, often portraying heroin addicts as tragic, misunderstood figures rather than victims of a powerful substance. Sensationalized newspaper stories, filled with dramatic language, described a hidden world of drug dens and clandestine parties. This was a double-edged sword. While it brought the issue to public light, it also made the drug seem alluring, a forbidden fruit reserved for the rebellious and the daring. It was a kind of anti-hero worship, where the self-destructive artist became a new kind of celebrity. The public was hungry for scandal, and the heroin craze provided it in spades. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this time is the way the slang associated with the drug seeped into everyday language. Phrases like poudre de lune, moon powder, for heroin itself, or fumer le dragon, to smoke the dragon, for the act of inhaling it, became part of the vernacular. This kind of code switching made the drug feel like a secret society, a private language that bound its users together. It added a layer of dangerous intimacy and exclusivity that only served to heighten its mystique. It reminds me of the secret handshakes and passwords we talked about before. But this was a whole new level of cultural infiltration. Historians still argue whether the media's portrayal of the drug was a simple reflection of the era's fascination with the macabre or if it was an intentional, albeit misguided, attempt to expose the problem by making it a public spectacle. You're walking past a newspaper stand, and a headline screams, "The Secret Lives of Paris's Opium Eaters." The accompanying article describes a beautiful, yet haggard woman, a princess of the night, whose life has been consumed by the drug. The tone is less of a warning and more of an invitation to voyeurism. The image in your mind is no longer of a person in pain, but a character in a dark, twisted fairy tale. The heroin craze of the 1920s was no longer a silent tragedy. It was a sensationalized drama playing out in the public eye. Its true horrors masked by the allure of a forbidden and glamorous world. The sensational headlines fade, but the reality of the heroin craze remains. While the press was romanticizing the drug, the people on the front lines, the police and judicial system, were scrambling to deal with a new type of crime they had no real way to handle. This is the part of the story where you see the established order trying to catch up to a fast-moving and slippery problem. And often, failing miserably. The mainstream historical fact that illustrates this is the profound lack of expertise and resources within Parisian law enforcement to combat the burgeoning black market. The police, the Sûreté, were well versed in dealing with common theft and political agitators. But they had no dedicated narcotics unit. No sophisticated surveillance techniques for drug networks. Their approach was often reactive and unsophisticated. They'd bust a small time dealer or a group of users. But they had no way to trace the supply back to its source. The smugglers we discussed earlier were always one step ahead. A raid on a clandestine den might capture a few addicts and a small amount of product. But the main operation would simply shift its location, leaving the police to chase shadows. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this time is the unusual collaboration between some police and the medical community. Or the lack thereof, given that heroin was still a pharmaceutical product. A police officer might arrest a user, only to have a doctor testify that the person was simply trying to self-medicate for a legitimate illness. This led to a kind of legal dance where users would often receive slaps on the wrist or be sent to sanitariums rather than prison. It was a well-intentioned, but ultimately ineffective, system that failed to grasp the full extent of addiction as a disease rather than a simple crime. It reminds me of the way we've seen history repeat itself with other substances, where society swings between treating addiction as a moral failing and a medical issue. Historians still argue whether the police's bungled response was a result of genuine incompetence, a lack of institutional will to tackle a problem perceived as a rich person's vice, or simply an unavoidable byproduct of a society that was so far behind the curve on a new type of social ill. You're watching a police officer on a cold, foggy street corner, looking frustrated. He has a small leather notebook in his hand, and he's scribbling down notes about a suspected drug den he just raided. But he knows it's useless. He knows the real players are untouchable, hiding in plain sight, living in elegant apartments and pulling the strings from behind a velvet curtain. He's just chasing ghosts. The law, which was meant to solve the problem, has only managed to create a new one. A profitable and dangerous underworld that flourishes in the shadows of the city of light. The elegant romance of the drug has been completely stripped away, leaving only a dark, grimy reality. The police officer's frustration hangs in the air. A thick, palpable fog. The black market we talked about isn't just a network of faceless smugglers and street dealers. It has a physical reality. A dark underbelly that is the flip side of the jazz clubs and glittering cabarets. This is where you go when the glamour is gone. When the need for the drug becomes a full-time job. You are now leaving the romanticized streets of Montmartre and descending into the hidden world of the drug den. The mainstream historical fact that brings this to life is the rise of the secret, unhygienic drug dens, often called fumeries or smoking parlors. These weren't the lavish, bohemian salons of the early craze. They were often squalid, poorly ventilated rooms in the back of bistros, basements of tenement buildings, or even in the private homes of addicts who sold to others to support their own habits. They were dark, smoky, and reeked of desperation. Here, the drug wasn't just injected, it was often smoked, a practice that gained popularity after the crackdown on needles, which were harder to acquire. The dens were a strange kind of community, a place where people who were outcast from society could find temporary solace in their shared affliction. A quirky or fringe tidbit of the day is the bizarrely specific set of rituals and tools that developed within these dens. The smoking of heroin often involved a practice known as chasing the dragon, where the user would heat the powder on a piece of tin foil or a similar surface and inhale the rising smoke through a straw or a rolled-up note. This was not a glamorous act, it was a desperate, almost pathetic ballet of need. The dens had their own rules, a hushed etiquette born of mutual understanding and the constant fear of being discovered. Historians still argue whether the proliferation of these dens was an inevitable consequence of the criminalization of the drug or if it was a symptom of a deeper societal failure to provide safe and effective treatment for addiction. You're standing in a narrow alley. A light rain starting to fall again. The air is cold and smells of stale alcohol and damp stone. A door, half hidden in the shadows, opens for a second, a slice of a dim, smoky interior visible before it closes again. You catch a glimpse of a handful of figures huddled together, their faces obscured by the smoke, their movements slow and listless. This isn't the city of light anymore. This is its dark, forgotten heart, a place where the promises of escape have soured into a grim and terrifying reality. The romance is gone. The bohemian dream has turned into a nightmare of quiet suffering, one that is playing out on every street corner, in every forgotten room, across the entire city. The alley is quiet now. The door to the hidden world of the fumery is shut, but the scent of desperation still lingers. The story of the heroin craze is nearing its end, and the final chapters are not about glamour or rebellion, but about the brutal, inescapable consequences of addiction. The party is officially over, and the morning after is filled with a collective sense of sorrow and loss. The mainstream historical fact that defines these final years is the undeniable and widespread devastation that the drug wrought on Parisian society. The myth of the non-addictive, heroic medicine had been utterly shattered. The city's morgues and hospitals saw a steady increase in heroin-related deaths and illnesses. Public figures who had once been symbols of the artistic avant-garde were now reduced to gaunt, broken figures. The private pain we've been observing for so long now became a public crisis. The stories of lost jobs, abandoned families, and shattered lives were no longer whispered behind closed doors. They were front-page news. It was no longer a question of whether the drug was dangerous. It was a question of how to stop the bleeding. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this time is the surprising rise of self-help and mutual aid groups, precursors to modern recovery programs. With little government support and a medical community that was still largely clueless about how to treat addiction, addicts themselves began to form informal networks to help one another. They would gather in quiet corners of parks or in back rooms of cafés. Not to get high, but to talk about their struggles, to share what little knowledge they had about getting clean, and to offer each other support in a world that had abandoned them. It was a grassroots response to a problem that was too big for anyone to solve alone. Historians still argue whether the final decline of the craze was a result of more effective law enforcement, the horrifying death toll that served as a clear warning, or the quiet, internal collapse of the black market as more and more people realized the fatal consequences of the drug. You're standing on the same bridge you started on, the Pont Neuf. The city lights are less romantic now. They feel like the harsh glare of a street lamp. The air is cold and unforgiving. You see a man, once a vibrant young artist, begging for a few francs on a street corner. His hands shaking, his face a roadmap of 1,000 bad decisions. The tragic glamour is gone. All that is left is a human being, a casualty of a war that was fought not with guns and trenches, but with a small, white powder. The city has seen its soul consumed by a monster it once welcomed with open arms. The jazz is silent, and the last echo of the heroic era is a mournful one. The cold air on the bridge feels like a final, sobering reality check. The tragic glamour of the 1920s heroin craze has faded into a mournful legacy. The story is over, but its echoes are still present. This final section is about the long shadow of that time, a reflection on what was lost and what was learned. Before we drift off into a peaceful sleep, the mainstream historical fact that we're left with is the lasting impact this era had on the regulation of narcotics globally. The horrors of the Parisian craze, and similar ones in other cities, served as a powerful catalyst for change. Nations began to work together through international agreements and conferences, realizing that the drug trade was a global problem that could not be solved by one country alone. The League of Nations, and later the United Nations, established international drug-controlled treaties that still form the basis of our global drug policy today. The chaotic, unregulated world of the 1920s gave way to a more controlled, albeit still imperfect, system. The careless, heroic medicine was finally, and definitively, classified as a dangerous substance. A quirky or fringe tidbit that feels fitting for our final thought is the way the art and literature of the time became a kind of inadvertent historical record. The hollow-eyed portraits of artists, the frenetic, drug-fueled poetry, and the tragic characters in novels became a kind of dark-side tourism for future generations. For a while, the fascination with the romanticized tragedy of these artists created a strange, ghostly legacy that continued to draw people in, a faint echo of the mystique we've been talking about. Historians still argue whether the lasting cultural legacy of this craze is a powerful warning against the dangers of substance abuse, or if it simply perpetuates the dangerous, false notion that addiction is somehow a prerequisite for artistic genius. Now, as the city goes quiet, the sound of the rain is a soft, steady rhythm, washing away the shadows. You feel the cold air on your skin, the quiet hum of a distant fan, the gentle weight of your own body settling deeper into the mattress. The images of the past begin to fade, the faces of the artists and the beggars, the smoke-filled rooms, the whispered transactions, they are all just ghosts now. And the city of light returns to a soft, golden glow. The story is done, the learning is complete. The only thing left to do is let your mind go quiet. Let the rain wash away any lingering thoughts, and allow yourself to sink into the deep, welcoming darkness of sleep.